Hi, I'm Patrick Symmes, and I wanted to answer two questions about my new book, The Day Fidel Died. First, how I did it. I wanted to give a little behind the scenes look at how I work. And second of all, more important, why did I write the book? The first question is pretty easy. The writing process for me comes almost entirely out of firsthand reporting. I write by traveling. I may get the actual writing done here at my desk, but the process starts with going and seeing. It's just definitive for me. I can't work without that kind of shoe leather process. I have made about 25 trips to Cuba over about 25 years, and I did three of them last year because there was so much going on. I had already been working for a long time on the idea that I would write a book about Fidel's life when he died. So I had roughed out over the course of years many passages about his history and his life that I thought were important. And then came 2016, which totally surprised me. When 2016 came along, Obama doubled down on his diplomacy with Cuba and made a visit to Havana. I was there. Then the Rolling Stones played their first concert ever in a country where they had once been banned. And lastly, towards the end of the year, in late November, Fidel Castro died. I had just created a draft of my book when he died. That was November 25th, 2016. It was a Friday night right after Thanksgiving, and I remember I was sitting at my kitchen table looking for a corkscrew to entertain some friends, and I looked at my phone and saw the news that he had died, and I went straight downstairs to my desk here, and I started writing. I stayed up till 4 in the morning writing. I wrote an obituary. I wrote an op-ed piece. I wrote essays about his life and what was going to happen to Cuba now. I kept that up for weeks and then worked very quickly to try to adapt my manuscript about Fidel to these tremendous events. The scramble to get to his funeral in December of 2016 was very memorable. Like these other events that year, just had to become the framework for the book. And once I had my manuscript updated, and I included recent developments with the Trump administration and Trump's pullback on Cuba policy, I realized what a great advantage it was to be writing an ebook when you have both a deep story that you want to do, a deeply reported long-form story, but also something that is a fast-moving target where Cuba policy was changing. And the ebook was a native format for that, and I think it's great that The Day Fidel Died is coming out that way. Maybe more important is the second question. Why did I write this book? This is my third book about Cuba, and it draws on those dozens of trips to the island. I am totally, obviously obsessed. There's just no two ways about it. Cuba, for me, was the answer to a question. I had, when I was young, been hitchhiking around Latin America. I'd traveled by riding the rails all over China. You can see Chairman Mao, my old pal, right behind me there. I came to realize that the Cuban Revolution had this global impact, very disproportionate to the size of this little island in the Caribbean. It was much bigger than just Cuba. It was about that moment in the 1960s. Cuba was the symbol of this vast revolutionary movement, this era. In 1991, I traced that back to the root, Havana, my first visit. I was captivated, and I wanted to answer that question. How did a romantic little island create these gigantic history-changing characters, these simultaneous epic failures and tremendous achievements in sports and education and so on, even as people were going hungry? Cuba, to me, is like one of those thought experiments in an ancient Greek philosophical school. They would debate what was the best form of government, and Castro is sort of this philosopher king who rules over this island undisputed, and the Cuban people were his experiment. the tension between his sometimes brutal, sometimes failed methods, which were the dictator part of him, and these very lofty goals as a proclaimed champion of the poor, the forgotten, that contradiction, the tensions in Cuba between those two identities fascinated me and always have. And that became the source, the motive power for me in my writing, decade after decade now. What made people into revolutionaries? How did they handle belief and disillusion? How was this all going to end for Cuba? That last question is very important for me. The next chapter in Cuban life, how the country goes forward after Fidel, after Obama, after this moment of engagement. I had been planning for years to address the meaning of Fidel's life, to interpret his history in that shorter format of an ebook, a more accessible form. Most books about Fidel's life are 1,000 pages long. Many a bookshelf has collapsed under the weight of all the biographies of Fidel Castro that are 1,000 pages long and weigh kilograms. I knew it had to be done in a less indulgent form, a faster way, a shorter, to-the-point reckoning with who he was. So I was ready for his death for years, but in the end it came just immediately on top of this incredible year of transformation in Cuba. Obama opened his secret negotiations with the Cubans. He put flags up on the two embassies, ours and theirs. In early 2016, he arrived in Havana on this personal visit that seemed, up to that moment, totally impossible. I was there. I soaked up the changes. I watched Obama walk around the cobblestone streets of Havana in the pouring rain. At the end of that week, the Rolling Stones showed up once their music had been banned. Now they were sort of really the first major international, big, spectacular entertainment phenomenon to hit Cuba in decades. And I think they really blew the minds of Cubans. At the end of the year, Fidel died quietly on a Friday night. His brother Raul was crying on television. I wrote the day Fidel died to try to balance those two tensions, what Fidel made during the whole of his lifetime and what forces are buffeting the island now. Cuba is trying to be reborn. There's a lot of desire, a lot of pent-up emotion and frustration and demand to fill in this great deficit that Cubans feel in so many forms of their life. Not everything is going to change, and I conclude the day Fidel died by arguing that eventually, in some form, even if democracy returns to the island, I think other members of the Castro family will be found. Probably they will emerge as leaders of the country or a faction within it. I've updated the book to reflect Trump's retrenchment on some policies, but in the end, I think the real power of decision lies with the Cuban people. I think they will decide things. Sooner or later, they will assert themselves in ways that shape the nation more than anything we outsiders do. Enjoy, thank you, and please share your feedback.